Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we got some great Kentucky history to talk about today. We're pleased to welcome Barry Craig, the author of True Tales of Old-Time Kentucky Politics, Bombast, Bourbon, and Burgoo. Barry's book delves into the very colorful history of Kentucky politics. Mr. Craig, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Real quickly, I always want to kind of start off with what is your Kentucky connection and so forth. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm 74 years old. I'm a native of Western Kentucky, lifelong Western Kentucky. I was born in Mayfield, grew up in Mayfield. Went to Murray State, got married, and in retirement, my wife and I live in Carlisle County, which is about as far west as Kentucky goes. Another 6 miles west from me, you're in the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. So I'm a deep Western Kentucky, and I'll tell you a little story about how we look at things. Some years ago when I was living in Mayfield, this man said, "Hey, do you know so-and-so?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't believe I do." He said, "Well, he just moved in here from Eastern Kentucky, over around Madisonville." And that was a purchased patriot who said that. Yeah. Anyway, I taught after I was a journalist for almost 13 years at the old Paducah Sun-Democrat and the Paducah Sun. I went to work at the community college in Paducah. Then it was Paducah Community College. It's now West Kentucky Community Technical College. Taught history and journalism there for 24 years and retired to my wife's home place, which I think your viewers might find interesting. The house was built in the 1880s. Wow. It's one of the oldest houses in Carlisle County. It was built by her great-grandfather, who was a country doctor. And while we were exploring the house, we discovered his medical saddlebags. He was a circuit riding doctor on horse. Even had some old medicine in it. We decided not to take it, but it was
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That is pretty interesting. Let's get into it. Let's talk about some Bombast, Bourbon, and some Burgoo. What are those terms, and what do they mean to Kentucky politics?
Well, Bombast I define as the high political art of using many words to say little or nothing. Examples are bountiful, but none are better, in my view, than a story that was a favorite story told by William O'Connell Bradley, who was Kentucky's first Republican governor, elected in 1895, and he's up in your neck of the woods from Garnered County. Let me begin by saying nearly all of these old-time politicians were masters at stump oratory. You live in politics by your stump wit. This is before television, before radio, before anything to make you look better. I know you've seen the generic campaign commercials where candidate X has holding his jacket over his shoulder, walking across a field with his kids. And if he stumbles and falls, it doesn't matter. They'll do it again. Mm-hmm. You didn't get any do-overs in this. It was strictly your wit to do it. And this was one of his favorite stories, and it's called Mullen's favorite speech, Mullen's famous speech. And it comes from Dr. Clark's book, Dr. Thomas D. Clark's book, The Rampaging Frontier. Now, according to the story, Mullins was an old-time legislator from Estill County, and he had gone up to the General Assembly in Frankfort on the Blue Wing, a Kentucky River steamboat, Well, once he got back home, he thought it was a good idea to give the voters an accounting of what he had done for them in our state capital. And it goes like this. Fellow citizens, when you elected me to the legislature, I wish that I might have the tallest pine tree that growed in the mountains, so that I might strip the limbs from same and make it into an enormous pen and dip it into the waters of the Kentucky River and ride across the clouds. God bless the people of Estill County. He's just warming up. He's just warming up. After you elected me, I went down to Frankfort on the Blue Wing. And as we wended our winding sinuosities amidst its labyrinthine meanderings, the birdlets, the batlets, and the owlets flew out in their secret hiding places and cried out to me in loud voices, "Sail on, Mullins, thy proud defender of thy country's liberties." When I reached Frankfort, I went up into that legislature hall and there spied many purty perlicues hanging on the ceiling, to pay for which you had been shamefully robbed by unjust taxation. When matters of small importance were before the body, I lay like a bull pup, a basket in the sunshine, with a blue bottle fly a tickling his nose. But when matters of great importance come up, I riz from my seat like the Numidian lion of the desert, shook the dewdrops from my mane, and gave 3 shrill shrieks for liberty. Now let's go back and examine that definition. Many words, you bet. Little or nothing, you bet. But people absolutely love this stuff because it was entertainment. It was fantastic. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Whig or whatever. People went to these rallies for the entertainment value. Uh-huh. And these old birds could really spin this stuff. That's it. Bourbon, that's, of course, the water of life, the aqua vita of Kentucky. I read some time ago that an early Kentucky politician, how you defined a statesman, was a politician who could drink grog all day and not get drunk. That, of course, is a gift. Burgoo. Now, earlier generations of Kentucky have known exactly what this was. It was a stew. I suppose it's similar to Irish stew or Brunswick stew. Basically, it's whatever meat you happen to have on hand or vegetables that you happen to have on hand. And it was so popular that an event that featured the stuff was called a burgoo. We're having a burgoo for Governor so-and-so or Senator such and such. And so, but get back to Bombast. Some people collect stamps. Actually, I do, but stamps, coins, whatever. But I've been collecting Kentucky political stories for years. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to share with your viewers a few of my favorites, time permitting, of course. I'm going to start out. I'm going to save the best for last, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I used to give speeches for the Humanities Council. I'd go around the state giving speeches on Kentucky politics. And I always enjoyed older audiences because they seem to appreciate this more than younger audiences. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they would say to me, "Hey, did you hear the one about Alvin Barkley saying this or Happy Chandler saying that or whatever?" So this story was told to me by a woman who actually heard it told by Alvin Barkley. Alvin Barkley was vice president. He achieved political fame from Paducah, although he was born in Graves County in a community called Wheel, which is near Fancy Farm. But Barkley loved to tell this story. And here it is. One day, a sheriff in a Kentucky county, not named, of course, was out patrolling. And up ahead, he saw a car weaving, swerving in and out, running off the road. Obviously, the person behind this wheel was under the influence of some spirituous liquid. So the sheriff turned on the lights, hit the siren, pulled the car over, gets out, walks over to the car, looks in the driver's window, and he's horrified to see behind the wheel a minister of the gospel of a certain church, which will remain nameless, which does not allow its members to allow alcoholic libations to cross the lips of its membership. Well, The sheriff is gobsmacked.
Mm-hmm.
So he looks in the car and he sees next to the minister a jug. So he says, "Preacher, what's in that jug?" Now, the good book says, "Thou shalt not lie." However, when you've been run in by the law and a big fine or jail sentence is at stake, maybe you can prevaricate. So the preacher says, "It's water." "Really?" "Yep, it's water." "Well, you don't mind if I have a look?" Well, you can't stop him from having a look. And so the sheriff reaches over, gets the jug, picks it up, uncorks it, takes a sniff, and says, "Preacher, there's alcohol in that jug." And the preacher says, "Praise Jesus, he's done it again." That has got to be one of my favorite Kentucky political stories. There are many, many, many like that. Number 2 on my list, and again, this is a blanket finish. 1, 2, 3. These are 3 great. Was the story of a man named Fess Whitaker. And when I first started giving this speech, I referred to him as the legendary Fess Whitaker. And I was giving this speech in Louisville. And a guy said, no. He wasn't legend. He was real. He was the jailer of Letcher County. And he even wrote his memoirs, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Anyway, Fess Whitaker was a hero of the Spanish-American War. An honest-to-goodness hero of the Spanish-American War. In fact, he rode with Teddy Roosevelt in the Rough Riders, the famous charge up San Juan and Kettle Hills in the Spanish-American War. So the battle is about to commence. Now, the Rough Riders are dismounted in this charge. There was a cavalry outfit. There was only one man on horseback, and that was Teddy Roosevelt. And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt was not the commander of this regiment. Colonel Leonard Wood was. But Teddy Roosevelt being Teddy Roosevelt, he didn't mind if you thought he was the commander of this. He was the assistant commander, lieutenant colonel. Anyway, so according to the story, Teddy Roosevelt knows that Corporal Fess Whitaker is his best soldier, unquestionably. So Teddy Roosevelt goes to Fess Whitaker and says, "Fess, we got to take that hill." And Fess replied, "Colonel, it's as good as took." "But Fess," he said, "there must be 1 million Spaniards up there." "I don't care, Teddy. We're going to take that hill." So the battle begins. Gunfire, machine guns, rifles, pistols, cannons, all kinds of stuff. Terrible, terrible carnage. And so, as you know the story, the Rough Riders took the hills. And as the smoke of battle cleared on top of the hills, there was Teddy Roosevelt on horseback, and he was absolutely happy, thrilled to see that Fess Whitaker had survived this terrible battle unscathed. So he rides up to Fess Whitaker and says, "Fess, this day will live in the annals of American military history forever." Fess said, "Yes, sir, Colonel, that is absolutely true." "And Fess," he says, "one of us is destined to be president of the United States." And Fess says, "Yes, Teddy, that is true. But I'll tell you what. You go ahead and be president. All I want to be is jailer of Letcher County, Kentucky." And Fess was elected. Now, Fess was obviously a character, one of many characters in the history of this great state. And so Fess was elected jailer. Well, the judge of Letcher County at the time, they were both Republicans, didn't like Fess. And he put up somebody else to run against him. Well, when Fess heard about that, he went to the judge and says, "Judge, did you put him up to run against me?" The judge said, "Yes, I did." So Fess did the honorable thing. He punched him in the face and got thrown in jail and was reelected from behind the bars of his own jail.
Oh, man.
There is a photograph in the Courier-Journal that shows Fess behind the bars saying, "Vote for me." After he was reelected out of jail, obviously, he and that judge met again, crossed paths, and Fess poured a pitcher of buttermilk over his head. Whoa. Now, here's the rub. Was Fess Whitaker in the Rough Riders? The answer is yes. Was he in the charge at San Juan Hill? What do you think?
I'm gonna say yes.
No. He joined the Rough Riders in 1899 after the war was over and was a cook.
Oh.
But who cares? That story, by the way, has been spun for any war. You pick a war, you can spin. That is one of the fun things about political stories in Kentucky. Candidates of all parties take these stories and spin them their way.
Yeah.
And they're absolutely wonderful. Now, I have saved the best for last. This, to me, is the greatest political story ever told in Kentucky. And it goes back to the 1915 governor's race between the Democrat Augustus Owsley Stanley of Henderson and the Republican Ed P. Morrow of Somerset. Now, back in those days, Western Kentucky was strongly Democratic, Eastern Kentucky strongly Republican. So these two guys pretty well reflected the regions that they came from. Now, these two guys were actually very good friends, very good friends. They traveled the state together in this campaign. They rode the same train cars. They stayed in the same hotel rooms to cut down on expenses. They ate meals together. And, of course, they drank from a bottle together. They got on the stump and tear each other a brand new one, as we say in Western Kentucky. I'm not going to say a brand new what, but you can probably guess on that. I bet you've heard that in Lincoln County.
Yeah.
Anyway. And then they would go and laugh and talk about it. They're buddies. So in my book, I used this incident to wrap up Bombast, Bourbon, and Burgoo. Morrow and Stanley were two outstanding stump speakers. They were stars in a star-studded lineup. Now, another woman told me, who was from Henderson, that she was quite elderly at the time, that she actually heard Stanley open his speech this way. This was his stock opening speech. And it goes like this. My name is Augustus Owsley Stanley. I'm from Henderson, Kentucky, where the cypress trees grow so tall that the topmost branches tickle the feet of Democratic angels in heaven, and where the roots grow so deep that they scratch the bald heads of Republican sinners in hell. And Morrow was his equal when it came to stump speaking. So it's a hot day, like we've been having lately. And these two fellows meet at a joint campaign appearance. Again, very warm, very humid. And of course, their hosts are plying them with ample amounts of Burgoo and bourbon whiskey. Now, usually Stanley and Morrow would take what we call 2 fingers of whiskey. I hope I can hold this up for the camera. This is 2 fingers, if you can see it. Dadgummit. Oh, wait, here we go. That's 2 fingers. Yeah, you can't see it. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Basically, it's your forefinger and your little finger, and then in the space in between. That's thwarted by modern technology. Anyway, so they had been consuming mass quantities of this stuff, and it's hot. And you can guess what's coming next. So it's now time to speak. They mount the platform, take a seat. They're introduced. And according to the accounts, Morrow went first and gave a reasonably coherent speech considering what he had ingested. And with great relief, he sat down. Now it was Stanley's turn. Stanley stands up from his chair. He can go no further. He cannot go forward. He cannot sit down. He's absolutely frozen. And in his stomach, the Civil War has broken out. Terrible, terrible, terrible fighting. 10 times as bad as Perryville. And the fighting begins to move up his gullet. Up. So he starts licking his lips, thinking that'll stop it. But of course it won't. And so eventually the fighting reaches his mouth, and he had no choice but to turn around backwards and vomit off the platform. Projectile vomit. Well, Morrow is saying to himself, thank you, God. Thank you, Jesus. I'm the next governor of Kentucky. That old bird, he cannot get out of this. He said that he did this in front of all these people and the media. He'll never, never, never live this down. Well, he should have known better. A.O. Stanley, the word surrender was not in his vocabulary. He wasn't about to quit the hustings over this.
Uh-huh.
So Stanley now is able to ambulate fairly well to the podium. He grips the podium with his left hand and his right hand. Still alcohol fog, but, well, I think maybe he'll be okay. So he looks out over the crowd and says, "Gentlemen, this is 1915. Women can't vote in Kentucky yet." He said, "Gentlemen, I wish to apologize to you for that disgusting display you have just witnessed. But you see, I couldn't help it. Every time I hear Ed Morrill speak, it makes me sick at my stomach." The crowd went wild. He won the election. And but Morrill later became governor as well. Dr. Thomas D. Clark was the living, well, he was the living authority on Kentucky history, period. But when I first ran across this story, it was back when in my newspaper days, and my wife read an article in the Courier Journal from the 1930s written by Alan Trout, the great Courier Journal writer. And she says, "Look at this story." And I said, "Yeah, this is amazing." But there was no attribution. It tells the story. So I thought, well, I know one person who's going to know exactly where this came from. No question about it. So I called Dr. Clark on the phone in Lexington. And I said, "Dr. Clark, I know you know the Stanley Morrill story about the vomiting." "Yes, I do." I said, "Well, I read about it in Alan Trout's column, but he didn't attribute it. Where did you hear it?" He said, "Stanley himself told me." I said, "That's a primary source. That is but that is my all-time favorite." And every time I'd see Dr. Clark after I talked to him on the phone, after I left the paper and was teaching at the community college there in Paducah, I wrote for the Associated Press a column called Kentucky Backroads. And so naturally, I resurrected that piece for the AP. And every time I talked to Dr. Clark, he was a terrific source of Kentucky history and folklore stories. And he would tell me a new Stanley story. And one of my favorites was he was at a gathering of ex-governors in Louisville. I think there were about 6 of them. And as he walks in the room, he says, "Fellas, there's 2 things I've had never want again." And they said, "What's that, Owsley?" They called him Owsley. And he smiled and said, "Gonorrhea and the governorship of Kentucky." I mean, it was a much less genteel era back then. And so anyway, as my wife just reminded me, she handed me a note like they do on TV, you know. So what happens to this stump speaking, this golden strand of stump speaking? And it goes all the way back to the very beginning in Kentucky's backwoods days. They were called stump speakers because guess what? Lots of times they would hop on a stump and give a speech. Henry Clay was a tremendous orator, as were many, many Kentucky politicians. But it stopped. And so I used to have a little cable TV show in Paducah, kind of like Wayne's World, I guess. But and I had Governor Julian Carroll on. Governor Carroll, who's deceased now, was from McCracken County, a little community called Heath. And people from Heath call themselves heathens. Anyway, so the governor, he's a good convert Presbyterian, by the way. Anyway, so I said, "Governor," I said, "you were an outstanding stump speaker." And he was. Republicans acknowledged that. And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Television killed it. You can't tell a stump speech in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
If you think about a stump speech, it takes time." Now, to give you an example of how you prepare yourself for a stump speech, Alvin Barkley, again from Paducah, his home still stands in Paducah. Barkley's grandson told me this story, that Barkley was in Washington when he was vice president under Harry Truman. And so his name was Spencer Truitt. Spencer had gone to dinner with his grandparents. And so Spencer tells a dirty joke. And Alvin said, "Now, Spencer, you should not have told that in front of your grandma. That was not nice. Don't do that." He said, "Oh, sir, Granddaddy, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that." "Well, don't let it happen again." Well, about 10 minutes later, Spencer's going down the hall, and there's Barkley in the bathroom practicing that joke against the mirror. So that's how they would do it. They would practice it they would practice in the mirror. But again, if you think, well, that story I told about Stanley throwing up, how long did that take? several minutes. You can't
Mhm.
do that on TV. So
Yeah.
it ended it. And today, as I say, politics has been television tamed uh, in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Now, to wrap that up, if you ever visit Frankfort, which I know you have many times, and I always admonish Kentuckians who live a fur piece from Frankfort like we do, go to Frankfort, go through the History Museum. That's fantastic. Go through the old Capitol, and then take a drive over to the cemetery where Daniel Boone and Becky Boone are buried. But it's a who's who of Kentucky politics. And so in that cemetery, you will find the grave of A.O. Stanley and Ed P. Morrill. And they're not too far away. The tombstones aren't. And I always thought at night, in the wee hours of the morning, their spirits rise from the grave and they clink glasses and they break out cigars and they tell political stories on each other.
Yeah.
Two wonderful, wonderful men. Another Stanley story was told me by a late historian in Graves County, my home county. Stanley brought his campaign for the governorship in 1915 to Mayfield, the Graves County seat, which sadly has been heavily damaged by that tornado a few years ago. And Stanley was to speak in front of the old Graves County courthouse, which dated the 1880s. That was a tornado victim. And so the woman was supposed to introduce him. And she was very nervous because this was a political candidate, a big star of Kentucky politics. And so she went to the podium. She was shaking. And by the way, she was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, no alcohol. And she noticed what she thought was a glass of water on the podium that was there for the governor or for the candidate. And so she thought, well, I don't think he'd mind if I took a sip. And you can guess what it was. It was moonshine. And the poor woman, I don't know how many prayers she had to say to absolve from that sin. But those were the kind of stories that were told. And these are marvelous stories. And as I said, I'm still collecting 74. I'm still collecting them. But I do lament the end of these stories because, again, a lot of these guys were lawyers. So they knew how to get up and argue before in a courtroom. But they were just gifted orators. Dr. Clark, and I hope I can get this quote exactly right, wrote in a book that, quote, sufficiently fired up with old crow, A.O. Stanley could hear his voice echo across the narrow waste of Kentucky, something like that. But that's what they were. And I've always enjoyed this state. I've also would suggest that Kentucky has more characters per capita than any state in the union. Now, I've had debates about that. I one time had a debate with he was the chair of the Louisiana Humanities Council. And we're talking about well, there's a famous poem, and it ends, and politics is the damnedest in Kentucky, Judge Milligan's famous poem. And so we were having a debate about that, and he said, well, he said, in Kentucky, they always told about voting the dead, and both parties did it. And he said, well, let me tell you a story about in Louisiana. He said there was a guy ran for sheriff of a parish. Of course, they have parishes instead of counties, being the French ones. He said, we had a guy who ran for sheriff of a parish, died before the election, and won anyway, fair and square. Bet you've never elected a dead one, have you? I said, no, I'm afraid we're and of course, he told stories of Huey Long. But these stories are delightful. I enjoyed them, and I'm still collecting them. And that was my first book. And it was a tremendous amount of fun writing it. But I really enjoy talking to people. Unfortunately, people who remember these, they're long gone now. Governor Carroll, I think he lived up into his 90s. He was governor in the 70s. But you're talking about people who were in office in the 20s and the 30s and even far back than that. But I love reading stories, love going to the Kentucky History Center there and go through the archives. And, I remember back when I was doing my master's thesis at Murray State, and Dr. Clark, he had said to me how much pleasure you get by actually handling manuscripts, to touch them, to feel them. And so I was doing some research in the Tennessee State Archives in Nashville. And so the Civil War is what I was looking at. So I was looking at Isham Harris, the governor of Tennessee in the Civil War, his papers. And this researcher said, "What are you doing?" I told him, "I said, what would you like to see some Andrew Jackson's papers?" I said, "Yeah." And so that actually handles some things that Andrew Jackson had read, and that's fascinating. And I can imagine something that Abraham Lincoln wrote. So that's all part of the fun of history. I know a lot of kids say that history is boring, which I can't imagine anyone saying that. And I used to tell my students, I tell them these stories, and they would say, "Well, is that true?" It's absolutely true. I said, "You don't need to make it fictional. History is stranger than fiction. It's more fun than fiction."
Yeah.
And every county is that way. Every county in Kentucky has a multitude of stories to tell. And when I wrote for the Associated Press, I traveled the state doing that and thoroughly enjoyed going to Maysville and Lewis County and all these places that are so far from us. And so those are my stories.
Yeah. Well, where can people get the book at?
It was published by the History Press. I think it's now the Arcadia Press. It is online. You can find it online. It's a paperback, not too expensive. It's not all funny, but a lot of it is. A lot of it is, and it's just full of these stories about all sorts of things. Those are my favorite stories. But it also, I'm trying to think what else is in there of interest. Of course, one of my favorites is from Lincoln County, the story of the militia pig.
Oh, yeah.
I think we talked about that.
Yeah.
Military units worldwide have these famous mascots, like the Irish Wolfhound, the British Bulldog, and all that sort of thing. And I ran across this one in Lewis and Richard Collins' Old History of Kentucky, which is, I'm sure, you've used up just standard work, published in the first edition came out in the 1840s. Then the Sun took it forward in the 1870s. And I ran across this story about these militia soldiers leaving with Governor Isaac Shelby to fight in the War of 1812 in Canada. And so they're marching along the road, and they look over the side of the road, and there are two old sows fighting in a mud wallow. Well, you can bet that stopped those Kentucky soldiers. And you can also bet they start laying down bets on who won. And so one of the sows ultimately emerged victorious. She crawled up out of the mud hole, served herself off, and off they went. Well, you know how when you go walking, sometimes some dog will follow you. Go home, go home, go home. Well, this pig started following them. This sow did. Followed them all the way to the Ohio River, swam the Ohio River, continued with them through up to Ohio to Canada. And when she got to the international boundary to the Great Lakes, she wouldn't go any further. And it was so, well, she was a coward. No, she was not a coward. She was simply exercising her militia rights. You cannot compel a militia soldier to cross the international frontier against his or her wishes. So actually, it was a good thing because the fellows went up to Canada, and again, you studied the War of 1812. Kentuckians didn't do too well up there. In fact, they got whipped. And home they came. And when they came back across the Great Lakes, there was the pig waiting for them. And I would always tell my students, well, you know, these guys are angry, they're cold, they're tired, they're hungry. And no, they did not put that pig to the knife. She continued back across, back to Kentucky with them. And to make a long story bearable, Governor Isaac Shelby himself adopted the pig, and she lived the rest of her life, as the book said, in ease and indolence on his farm there in Lincoln County. I have visited the graveyard. I looked all around, couldn't find the pig. But I doubt you'd bury a pig in a family graveyard.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is a terrific story.
Yeah.
You can't make this up. And I tell these kids, I said, look, go to Collins History of Kentucky, Volume 2, look up the chapter on Lincoln County, and you'll find this. I love this stuff. So, anyhow.
Yeah. What real quickly before we wrap
sure.
up, what's some other books you've got more than one? You can plug those real quick as well.
It's time, shameless self-promotion time. However, I always say I will autograph a book for you unless you think it'll ruin the yard sale value. I wrote a book. The University Press very kindly published 3 of my books. One of them was on the Civil War and the Jackson Purchase. Another was on the Kentucky's Confederate Press in the Civil War. And the third, and this is my all-time favorite book, it's called Kentuckians in Pearl Harbor. This particularly resonated with me because I am a baby boomer, 74 years old. Those of us in our generation, we had fathers who fought in the Second World War. I used to tell my students, I thought everybody's dad fought in World War II. Looked at me like, are you crazy? But it's about Kentuckians and their experiences at Pearl Harbor, not just sailors and soldiers and airmen, Marines who were there, but the home front. Mm-hmm. What was it like on the home front? What were you doing when you heard Pearl Harbor was bombed? It was especially poignant to me because, again, my dad joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor, and my father-in-law joined the Army. They're both gone, sad to say, like most of the greatest generations, Tom Brokaw aptly called them. And so we went out to Honolulu to do some research for the book. Did I also find time to go to the beaches? Yeah, I did. Gorgeous place. But to go there where my father had been and where my father-in-law had been, it was special. We went out to Schofield Barracks where my father-in-law was stationed, of course, with no way of knowing where he was. And in Pearl Harbor itself, there was no way of knowing. But that particular book, and again, it was special to me because I've got my dad's Navy uniform framed in my office, and we have my father-in-law's Army uniform. My dad was a petty officer first class, and my father-in-law was a first sergeant. And so that meant a lot to me. That book meant more to me than all the rest of them combined, I'll be honest with you. As much as I love Kentucky politics, this book really hit home. I had a sailor who was on the Arizona, interviewed him. He survived when the Arizona blew up. He somehow survived. The most tragic story in the book is about a family from central Kentucky, I believe around Shakertown, that area. They got the telegram. We regret to inform you that your son is missing and presumed dead or killed in action. A second telegram came that said, we made a mistake. Your son is still alive.
Oh, wow.
And then a third telegram came that said, no.
Oh.
And this is all during the Christmas season. You can just imagine what horrible Christmases, what terrifying Christmases these families had all during that period. And we live in an age of instant modern communication. Get on a cell phone, hey, I'm okay. That's not the way it was back then. You had telephones, you had telegraphs, but you can bet all that was jammed up with military traffic. They didn't have time for you to get on the phone and say, hey, mom and dad, I'm okay. And it was done by telegrams. And there were a lot of mistakes made. Mm-hmm. These ships were sunk. They were damaged. They were calling the roll, and you didn't answer. So they assumed the worst.
Yeah.
But again, that's by far my favorite book. The University Press did that one. You can get all three of those from the University Press. Shameless self-promotion again. Sorry.
It's all right. That's all right. And you know what? We appreciate you coming on and talking about some bourbon.
Enjoyed it.
Bombast and Burgoo. And we can arrange another time. You can come in and
I'd love it.
About those other books as well.
I would love it. My wife and I years ago went to Ireland and kissed the Blarney Stone, and my friend said we couldn't tell any difference. My son's always saying, Dad, do you talk to everybody? And I said, yes, you should know that by now. It just embarrasses him terribly. But there's a T-shirt that I would love to buy, and it says, embarrassing my children, just on the service of parenthood. If I can promise it's embarrassing my child, I'll buy it and wear it. Haven't done it so far. Well, thanks for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed this. Let's do it again.
It sounds good. Thanks for coming on, and thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.